On a frozen desert night, a wild mother lion knocked on a man's door. Days later, she would save his life. On one of the coldest nights the Utah desert had seen in many years, a man living alone heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he didn't find a lost traveler or a neighbor who needed help. He found a freezing mother lion. Her body was failing. Her cubs were barely breathing. What happened next would go against every rule of nature. Days later, it would shock everyone who saw the impossible friendship that followed. The high desert of southern Utah didn't howl the way mountains did. It whispered, a long, dry breath that slid through canyons and over smooth rock like a secret. But tonight, the whisper turned sharp. Cold poured down from the sky, as if the stars had cracked open and spilled winter straight onto the earth. Snow didn't fall in soft flakes here. It came sideways, grainy and stinging, riding a wind that scraped the red stone clean and erased every familiar line of the land. The mesas disappeared. The juniper trees became dark smudges. Even the moon looked afraid to show its face. In that moving white, something large struggled forward, low to the ground, shoulders rolling, legs unsteady with tiredness. A lioness. She did not belong in this world. Not in this cold. Not on this rock that smelled of dust and iron instead of grass and sun. Her coat, once the color of warm honey, was dulled by ice, clumped into hard ridges along her spine. Frost covered her whiskers. Her breath came out thin and rough. Each breath out was a small cloud that disappeared too fast. Pressing against her belly were two cubs. Tiny bodies tucked so close they looked like part of her shadow. They were too young for this kind of night. Their ears were still rounded with baby softness. Their paws were still clumsy with newness. Their fur, damp with melted snow and wind, trembled in shakes that grew weaker by the minute. The lioness paused behind a boulder the size of a truck, using it as a shield against the wind. She lowered her head to the cubs, nudging each one with her nose in a slow, careful check, counting life the only way a mother could. One cub let out a thin sound, more breath than cry. That sound was a rope tied around her heart. She had fought hunger before. She had fought heat, thirst, the hard math of survival when the world offered nothing but distance. She had known fear. She had known pain. But this cold was a different enemy. It did not roar or chase. It didn't show teeth. It simply wrapped itself around her family and waited, patient and invisible, for warmth to run out. She lifted her head, eyes narrowed against the white storm. She needed shelter, something that stopped the wind, something that held heat. A cave, a hollow, a place to press her body around her cubs and become their wall. But the high desert gave her only rock and open space. And tonight, even the rock felt like ice. She moved again, stepping forward with a careful, staggering strength. Her paws broke through crusty snow into slick patches of frozen stone. Her muscles clenched at every slip. Under her ribs, the cubs bumped and shifted, trying to keep their faces tucked in where her warmth still lived. She tried not to think of the strange path that had brought them here. How the world had changed around them without warning. How senses that once meant safety had turned sharp and wrong. How the night had filled with unfamiliar sounds and lights and fear. She kept her mind small. One step, then another. Keep them close. Keep them breathing. The wind surged and the cubs squealed, startled. The lioness pressed herself lower, letting the storm hit her back instead of theirs. For a moment she stood like that, an animal carved into the night, enduring. Then she saw it. At first it was only a faint glow, almost swallowed by the snow. A square of light, warm and steady, flickering through the white like a lantern trapped inside the world. The lioness froze. Her chest rose and fell quickly. Her eyes locked onto that impossible color. Light meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Fire also meant humans. Her body knew humans the way prey knew a trap. By instinct, by memory, by the ache of caution that lived in the bones. She had learned long ago that humans changed the rules. Humans didn't hunt because they were hungry. They hunted because they could. They took what they wanted and called it control. The lioness took one step backward. The wind shoved her forward again. One cub's breathing hitched, tiny, uneven, like a candle sputtering. The lioness looked down, and something inside her shifted. Fear was still there, but it bowed under something older, something that didn't negotiate. A mother didn't measure risk the way the world did. A mother measured what she could not lose. She turned toward the light. Each step felt heavier now, not just because of her tiredness, but because she was walking into the unknown, into the territory of the one creature that had ever made her feel truly powerless. The snow clung to her eyelashes. Her paws burned with numb pain. Still she moved, driven by the fragile warmth pressed against her belly. The closer she got, the stronger the smells became. Wood, smoke, metal, oil, something like old paper. And beneath it all, human. Faint but unmistakable, stitched into the air the way a campfire stitches itself into a night. The building appeared from the storm like a stubborn thought. A small building sat on a rise of rock, half sheltered by a low cliff. Not a house in any ordinary sense. It looked like something built to last. Flat roof, heavy walls, a narrow porch, and a single window glowing gold behind frosted glass. A weather station, or what used to be one. The lioness reached the porch steps and stopped. The boards creaked under her weight. The sound startled her. It was too loud in the silence, too human. Her cubs shifted and she tightened her body around them as if she could hide them from whatever waited beyond that door. She lifted her head. The door was metal, painted a dull gray that blended with the storm. There were no cracks of light around its edges. It was sealed against the cold with the kind of care that came from someone who knew what winter could do. Her instincts screamed at her to turn away, to find a rock and curl up and fight the storm like she had fought every other enemy, to keep her pride intact. But pride didn't warm cubs. She took one slow step closer. Her breath hit the door and fogged it faintly, disappearing almost at once. She lowered her head, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no movement inside. The cubs were so quiet now it frightened her. She shifted her weight and gathered what strength she had left, lifting one paw. Her claws, made for tearing, for holding, for defending, hung for a moment in the air like a question. Then she brought them softly against the metal. A small tap. Not a strike. Not an attack. A request, as humble as an apex predator could make it. Inside, the lioness could hear nothing. But she could imagine a life on the other side of that door. Warmth. Stillness. The soft crackle of something burning. A world where the wind could not reach. Her paw dropped. She waited. The storm pushed at her back, impatient. Snow piled against the porch rail. The lioness blinked slowly, trying to keep her eyes open. Her legs shook. Her body ached with the weight of holding on. She tapped again, slightly louder this time. Not from aggression, but from desperation. Still no answer. The lioness's chest tightened. She lowered her head to her cubs and nudged them gently, as if to say, "Hold on. Please hold on." One cub's tiny paw twitched against her fur, searching for warmth that was slipping away. The lioness lifted her head once more. Somewhere beyond the metal, beneath the steady hum of wind and the thick walls, a sound finally shifted. The faintest scrape of a chair leg on the floor. A pause. Then silence again, but a different kind now, one that felt like someone holding their breath. The lioness stood perfectly still, snow gathering on her back like ash. On the other side of the door, a man's voice, low and uncertain, as if he hadn't used it in hours, moved through the warmth. What was that? The question left Ethan Walker's mouth quietly, almost apologetically, as if he were afraid of startling the sound away. He stood in the middle of the small weather station, one hand resting on the edge of the metal table where old climate logs lay stacked in uneven piles. The room smelled faintly of burned pine and machine oil. A space built for work, not comfort. But it was warm. And in a night like this, warmth felt like a luxury. He waited. The wind slammed into the building again, rattling the window panes hard enough to make the hanging thermometer clink against the wall. Ethan told himself that was all it had been. Wind. Debris. Something loose finally giving in after hours of pressure. This place groaned and sighed all night long. He'd learned to tune most of it out. Still, his eyes drifted to the door. Ethan had lived alone in this station for nearly 3 years, ever since he'd taken the private contract to monitor weather oddities across the high desert. The work suited him. Numbers didn't ask questions. Instruments didn't look at him with sympathy or expectation. Out here, the world reduced itself to wind speed, temperature drops, pressure shifts, things with causes that could be measured and outcomes that made sense. People were harder. He took a step toward the door, then stopped, listening again. Silence pressed in, thick and uneasy. His instincts, sharpened long ago in wildfire zones and evacuation corridors, stirred awake. Something about the sound hadn't been random. It had been deliberate. Ethan glanced at the digital monitor mounted near the window. Outside temperature, 12 degrees and falling. Wind gusts nearing 40 miles per hour. No sane person would be knocking on a door in conditions like that. No one even knew he was up here tonight. He'd made sure of that. Another scrape sounded. Soft. Dragging. Almost hesitant. Ethan's shoulders tightened. He crossed the room slowly, boots quiet against the concrete floor. With his left hand, he reached for the heavy flashlight clipped near the door. With his right, he rested his palm against the metal, feeling the cold seeping through even from the inside. He hesitated there, breathing steady, the way he used to before stepping into smoke-choked canyons where visibility vanished and every choice mattered. "Hello," he called out, voice firmer now. "If you're out there, you need to speak up." No answer. Only the wind hissing across the porch like something alive. Ethan swallowed and pulled the door open. The storm rushed inside first, a blade of cold air slicing across the room, carrying snow with it. White sprayed across the floor, stinging his ankles. He squinted into the glare of the porch light. And then his mind stalled, struggling to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. A massive shape lay half-collapsed against the threshold. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a sculpture, some trick of shadow and snow. Then the shape shifted. Ethan froze. A lioness lay sprawled across the porch boards, her body angled unnaturally, as if she had fallen and simply stayed there. Ice crusted her fur in jagged patterns. Her side rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Beneath her ribcage, two small forms were tucked so tightly they were almost hidden. Cubs. Ethan's first instinct was pure electric fear. Every warning he'd ever learned slammed into him at once. Apex predator. Unpredictable behavior. Strength beyond calculation. His body reacted before his thoughts did. His grip tightened on the flashlight. His foot slid back, ready to retreat. Then the lioness lifted her head. Not high. Not in challenge. Just enough for her eyes to meet his. They weren't wild with aggression. They weren't fixed on him as prey. They were dimmed by exhaustion. Something in Ethan's chest cracked open at the sight. He had expected teeth, tension, the coiled readiness to strike. Instead, what he saw was a creature barely holding herself together. Her gaze flicked once toward the cubs pressed against her belly, then back to him, as if checking whether he understood what was at stake. The cubs didn't move. Ethan felt the cold rush up his spine, sharper than the wind. He stepped forward despite himself, lowering the flashlight to get a better look. One cub's side fluttered faintly. The other was frighteningly still. Jesus! The word slipped out before he could stop it. The lioness made no sound. No growl. No warning. She simply watched him, her chin trembling slightly as if the effort of holding it up was too much. Snow gathered on her back in soft drifts. She didn't shake it off. Ethan's thoughts spiraled. This wasn't possible. Lions didn't live here. They didn't wander into snowstorms and knock on doors like lost travelers. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Escape from some illegal private collection. Maybe a failed roadside menagerie. Something human. Something irresponsible. None of it mattered right now. The cub closest to him let out a faint, broken sound. It was barely audible, more breath than voice, but it hit Ethan harder than any alarm ever had. His throat tightened. Without warning, a memory rose up. Small hands. Cold fingers. A child shivering beneath two thin blankets while sirens wailed somewhere far away. He pushed the memory down hard. "You're freezing," he said, though he didn't know who he was speaking to. The lioness, the cubs, himself. All of you. The lioness's eyes stayed on his face, unblinking. Ethan straightened slowly, backing up just enough to widen the door. The warmth inside spilled out in a visible wave, fogging the air around the lioness's muzzle. One cub stirred weakly toward it, instinctively drawn. This was insane. Every rule Ethan had ever lived by told him to shut the door, to call authorities, to protect himself and let the system handle what it was built to handle. He could already hear the arguments forming in his head. Safety, liability, protocol. But the system didn't stand on his porch right now. A mother did. Ethan took another step back, holding the door open wider. He raised his free hand, palm out, not in threat, but in a gesture he barely remembered using on frightened evacuees years ago. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The lioness didn't move. She didn't advance. She simply gathered herself, inch by inch, dragging her massive body forward with a soft, exhausted sound as her claws scraped the porch. The cubs shifted beneath her, their tiny paws brushing the threshold. When her front leg crossed into the warmth, she paused, as if waiting for the blow that never came. Ethan held his breath. Nothing happened. Slowly, with dignity that seemed impossible given her condition, the lioness pulled herself fully inside. Her legs buckled almost immediately, and she collapsed onto the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow thud. One cub rolled free, landing limply at her side. Ethan dropped to his knees without thinking. Up close, the cub was shockingly light. Too light. Its fur was icy to the touch. Its body rigid with cold. Ethan felt panic surge, sharp and focused, the way it always had when someone's life balanced on seconds. He scooped the cub up and turned toward the heater by the far wall, every movement careful, controlled. Behind him, he was acutely aware of the lioness's presence. He felt her attention like a weight between his shoulders. She did not follow. She did not rise. She only watched him, eyes wide and unblinking, as he carried her cub into the warmth. For the first time that night, the storm outside did not sound like the greatest danger in the world. Something else had begun. Ethan could feel her eyes on him, as clearly, as if a hand rested between his shoulder blades. He knelt beside the heater, cradling the cub against his chest, counting breaths the way he'd been trained to do long ago. Slow, steady, controlled. The cub's body was stiff, its tiny ribs barely moving beneath the thin fur. Too cold. Dangerously cold. Ethan adjusted his grip, pressing the cub gently against the warmth, careful not to shock it with sudden heat. Behind him, the lioness shifted. The sound was subtle, just the scrape of claw against concrete, but it tightened every muscle in Ethan's back. He didn't turn around. Not yet. He knew better than to move suddenly when fear sat this close to the surface. His or hers. "I'm helping," he said quietly, more to steady himself than anything else. "I know it doesn't look like it, but I am." The heater hummed, filling the room with a low mechanical breath. Ethan peeled off his outer jacket and wrapped it around the cub, leaving only its small face exposed. A faint puff of air brushed his thumb. Alive. Relief hit him so hard his vision blurred for a second. He reached for a towel from the supply cabinet, then froze. The other cub. Ethan turned slowly, every movement deliberate. The lioness lay on her side near the door, chest rising unevenly, frost melting into dark patches beneath her body. One cub was still tucked close against her stomach. The second lay half a foot away, where it had rolled when she collapsed. It hadn't moved. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He rose carefully, keeping his hands visible, his posture low and non-threatening. The lioness's head lifted a fraction, muscles tensing despite her exhaustion. Her ears flattened, not in aggression, but in warning. "I won't take it away," Ethan murmured. "I promise." Her gaze flicked from his face to the cub and back again, sharp and assessing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm howled outside, rattling the walls as if impatient with the silence inside. Then the lioness did something Ethan would never forget. She shifted her front leg just enough to clear space, and nudged the cub toward him with her nose. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate. Ethan swallowed hard. He stepped forward and knelt beside the cub, his hands steady even as his pulse raced. The cub's body was frighteningly cold, its limbs limp as if the bones themselves had forgotten how to hold shape. He lifted it carefully, bringing it against his chest, mirroring the position of the first cub near the heater. As he did, the lioness let out a low, broken sound. Not a growl. Not a roar. something closer to a breath torn loose from deep inside her chest. Ethan met her eyes. "I've got them," he said, voice rough. "Both of them." The lioness's head lowered back to the floor. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but she did not look away from him. That was when Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't a moment. It wasn't a decision he could undo after the storm passed. The second he had picked up that first cub, the world had shifted under his feet. The careful distance he'd built between himself and anything that could break him had collapsed. He moved with purpose now. Ethan dragged a thick thermal blanket from the emergency locker and spread it on the floor near the heater, creating a nest of warmth. He placed both cubs side by side, rolling the blanket around them in loose layers that trapped heat without restricting movement. Then he adjusted the heater's angle, keeping the warmth indirect. Field training took over. Warmth. Shelter. Time. He glanced at the lioness. Her breathing had slowed, but it was shallow, uneven. She was burning energy she didn't have, just staying conscious. Ethan grabbed another towel, soaked it with warm water from the kettle, and wrung it out before approaching her again. He stopped a few feet away. "Can I?" he asked, the words feeling strange and foolish in the quiet room. The lioness didn't move, didn't flinch. She only watched him, eyes glassy but alert. Ethan took the smallest step closer and draped the warm towel across her shoulder, rubbing gently to work heat back into the frozen muscle beneath her fur. The skin quivered under his touch. He waited for resistance. It never came. Minutes passed. Then more. The cubs' breathing grew steadier, their bodies relaxing as warmth seeped in. One of them twitched, releasing a weak squeak that made Ethan's chest tighten all over again. "You're fighters," he whispered. "All of you." The lioness's eyes closed for a moment, then opened again. She shifted her head, angling it toward the cubs, reassured by the sound. Ethan exhaled long and shaky. He had no plan beyond the next hour. No idea what he would tell anyone if they found out what he'd done. No illusion that this was safe, legal, or sane. But as he sat there on the concrete floor, surrounded by heat and breath and the slow return of life, one thing became painfully clear. He wasn't leaving. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. The door behind them rattled as the wind surged again, but it might as well have belonged to another world now. Ethan pulled the blanket higher around the cubs and settled beside them, positioning himself between the heater and the lioness, forming a quiet triangle of shared warmth. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be redrawn. The storm did not loosen its grip as the night stretched on. If anything, it seemed to sense the fragile pocket of warmth inside the weather station and pressed harder against the walls, rattling the metal siding in sharp, impatient bursts. Snow piled against the door until the bottom edge disappeared, sealing them in like a promise that whatever happened next would happen together. Ethan lost track of time. Minutes blurred into hours as he moved with quiet purpose, tending to the small, fragile circle of life he'd taken responsibility for. He adjusted the heater again, then again, careful not to let the air grow too dry. He rotated the cubs gently, rubbing their paws and ears in slow, rhythmic motions to coax circulation back without shocking their systems. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, stripped of panic. The lioness watched everything. She lay on her side near the wall now, closer to the heater than before. Her massive frame curled protectively, even in exhaustion. Steam rose faintly from her fur as ice melted and darkened the concrete beneath her. Her breathing remained shallow, but it had found a rhythm, and Ethan clung to that sound like an anchor. At some point, one of the cubs let out a stronger cry, a small, offended squeak that cut clean through the low hum of the heater. Ethan froze, then smiled before he could stop himself. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't strong. But it was alive. "That's it," he murmured. "That's what I want to hear." The lioness lifted her head at once, eyes locking onto the cub. Her body tensed, ready to move. But when Ethan gently shifted the cub closer to its sibling, she relaxed again. Her gaze flicked to him, sharp and searching, then softened just a fraction. It was trust. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to set it aside. Ethan felt the weight of it settle into his chest, heavier than responsibility, heavier than the risk he'd taken. He'd faced dangerous situations before. Walls of fire, collapsing terrain, crowds running in blind panic. But none of those moments had ever felt this intimate. This exposed. He checked the cubs again. Their breathing was steadier now, their bodies no longer rigid. One of them twitched, stretching a tiny paw against the blanket as if testing the world. Ethan's hands trembled as he tucked the blanket back into place. Behind him, the lioness shifted and let out a low sound, barely audible. Not a warning. Not a threat. Something closer to a vibration, deep, rough, and filled with effort. Ethan turned toward her slowly. "You're doing good," he said, the words slipping out before he could question them. "They're hanging on." He knelt beside her, keeping his movements calm, his posture low. The heat had begun to work its way through her coat now, revealing the rich gold beneath the frost. Scars lined her side, old ones, healed long ago, telling stories of a life lived hard and earned honestly. He soaked another towel in warm water and wrung it out, then pressed it gently against her shoulder. The muscle beneath his hand quivered. Her eyes fluttered shut, then opened again, fixing on him with an intensity that made the small room feel suddenly crowded. Ethan held still. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly. "Not tonight." The lioness's breathing slowed further. Her massive paw shifted, claws scraping softly against the floor as she tucked it closer to her chest. She did not pull away from his touch. The hours crept by in fragments, checking the heater, adjusting blankets, listening to the storm batter itself senseless outside. Ethan's legs ached from kneeling. His back stiffened. But he didn't move far. Sleep hovered at the edge of his awareness and never quite landed. At some point, exhaustion dragged him down beside the heater. He leaned back against the wall, head tipping forward, eyes closing for a few stolen seconds. In the quiet, memories crept in uninvited. Hospital lights. Cold rooms. The terrible stillness that followed when warmth arrived too late. Ethan's eyes snapped open. The cubs were still breathing. The lioness had shifted closer, her body angled slightly toward him now, forming a barrier between him and the door. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't possessive. It was protective. The realization sent a slow, shuddering breath through him. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind dropped from a scream to a hiss, then to a tired whisper. Snow still fell, but softer now, settling instead of striking. Inside the station, the cubs slept, their bodies rising and falling in small, steady rhythms. The lioness's eyes closed fully for the first time, her breath deepening as warmth claimed ground the cold had nearly stolen. Ethan sat there, watching the three of them, feeling something unfamiliar loosen inside his chest. He didn't know what morning would bring. He didn't know how this would end, or who would come knocking once the storm cleared. He only knew that for one long, impossible night, predator and human had shared the same shelter, bound not by instinct or fear, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to let life slip away. The heater hummed on, and beneath its steady breath, something fragile but real took hold. Morning arrived cautiously, as if the desert itself wasn't sure it was allowed to return after the long night that had passed. The storm had burned itself out somewhere before dawn, leaving behind a brittle stillness that pressed against the weather station like a held breath. Pale light crept through the frosted window, touching the concrete floor and the scattered blankets with a faint, uncertain warmth. Ethan stirred first. His body protested as he shifted, muscles stiff from hours on the floor. For a split second he forgot where he was. Forgot the storm, the cold, the impossible visitors. Then he heard it, a soft, uneven sound, close and real. Breathing. He sat up quickly, heart hammering, and looked toward the heater. The cubs were still curled together beneath the blanket. Their bodies relaxed now, chests rising and falling in small, steady motions. One of them twitched in its sleep, letting out a tiny, indignant puff of air. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Across the room, the lioness lay stretched on her side, her body no longer rigid with cold. The golden tones of her coat had returned where the frost had melted away, catching the weak morning light. Her eyes were open, alert, but calm, following Ethan as he moved. "You made it through the night," he murmured. "All of you." The lioness's tail flicked once against the floor, not in warning, just movement, awareness. Ethan rose carefully and checked the monitors by the window, out of habit more than necessity. Temperatures were climbing slowly but steadily. Wind speeds had dropped to almost nothing. The worst of it was over. That should have brought relief. Instead, a new tension settled into his chest. Because daylight brought visibility. And visibility brought questions. He crossed to the window and wiped a patch of frost away with his sleeve. The high desert stretched out below the station, deceptively peaceful under a fresh blanket of snow. Tracks crisscrossed the ground, some old, some new. Animal movement. Wind patterns. And something else. Ethan frowned. A faint line cut across the snowfield near the ridge road. Tire tracks. Someone had been out there. He stepped back from the window, pulse quickening. No one was supposed to be nearby during a storm like last night. The access road was rarely used in winter, and the weather station didn't broadcast its data publicly. Unless. A soft electronic chime interrupted his thoughts. The thermal monitor on the firewall flickered, updating its readout. Ethan stared at the screen, a sinking feeling forming in his gut. The heat signatures inside the station were still registering well above baseline. 3 large mammals and 1 human, in a structure that normally housed exactly 1 warm body. Anyone with access to regional monitoring equipment would notice the oddity. Ethan turned toward the lioness. She had risen onto her front legs now, muscles taut beneath her fur, her gaze fixed on the door. She sensed it too. Something approaching. Something unfamiliar threading its way toward their fragile calm. The cubs stirred, responding to the shift in her posture. Ethan moved quickly, gathering the blankets closer around them, lowering the heater just a fraction. "Easy," he whispered. "We're okay." The sound of boots crunching on snow reached them moments later. Ethan's head snapped up. The footsteps were measured. Careful. Not the heavy tread of someone charging in blind panic, but not hesitant either. Someone trained to move through rough terrain. Someone who knew where they were going. A knock sounded at the door. Firm. Human. Unmistakable. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then stood. He positioned himself instinctively between the door and the lioness, raising one hand slightly, not in surrender, but in readiness. "Who is it?" he called out. "Ethan Walker?" A woman's voice answered, clear despite the cold. "My name's Maya Collins. I'm with the County Ranger Service. I need to speak with you." The lioness let out a low rumble deep in her chest. Ethan didn't move toward the door yet. "About what?" There was a pause. About the thermal spike coming from this station, Maya said. And the fact that it doesn't match anything in our records. Ethan swallowed. He glanced back at the lioness. Her ears were angled forward now, not pinned flat. Her body coiled, but still. Watching him. Waiting. I'm opening the door, he said quietly, more to her than to the woman outside. No one's here to hurt you. Her eyes held his. Then slowly, she lowered her head. Ethan pulled the door open. Cold air spilled in, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and something unmistakably human. A woman stood on the porch, bundled in a ranger's jacket, her dark hair pulled back beneath a wool cap. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the interior with professional efficiency. They landed on the lioness. Maya froze, for a heartbeat. The world seemed to tilt. Her hand twitched toward the radio clipped to her jacket, then stopped. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again as her gaze flicked from the lioness to the cubs, then back to Ethan. "What?" she said slowly. "What is that doing here?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stepped fully into view, making sure she saw him first, not the animal behind him. "They were freezing," he said. "They would have died last night." Maya's jaw tightened. "That's a mountain lion," she said, though the words sounded automatic, rehearsed. "And those are cubs." "Yes," Ethan replied. "I know." Her eyes flicked to the heater, the blankets, the careful arrangement of warmth and space. She took a cautious step forward, then stopped when the lioness's rumble deepened. Maya lifted both hands slowly. "Easy," she said, not sure who she was addressing. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Ethan watched her carefully. Maya wasn't panicking. She wasn't shouting or reaching for a weapon. But he recognized the tension in her shoulders, the calculation happening behind her eyes. Law, protocol, public safety, all the things that didn't bend easily around compassion. "You need to call this in," Maya said after a moment. "This isn't something we can ignore." Ethan felt the familiar surge of defiance rise in his chest. "If you call it in right now," he said, "they'll take her. Or worse." Maya hesitated, her gaze softening just a fraction as one of the cubs let out a sleepy sound. "And if I don't," she said quietly, "and someone gets hurt, that's on me." Silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. Behind Ethan, the lioness shifted, her body angling subtly toward the cubs, placing herself between them and the open door. Maya noticed. Her breath caught. "I've been doing this a long time," she said, her voice lower now. "I've never seen one of them act like that." Ethan didn't take his eyes off her. "Neither have I," he said. "That doesn't make it less real." The wind stirred the snow outside, whispering against the porch rail. The morning light crept higher, exposing everything that night had hidden. Maya exhaled slowly. "I'm not calling it in," she said at last. "Not yet." Ethan's chest loosened a fraction. "But this doesn't disappear," she added. "People are going to ask questions. And when they do, we need a plan." Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. Because the storm had passed. And the world was waking up. The desert changed its mind after sunset. What had looked calm and harmless under the pale afternoon sun hardened again as darkness settled in. Heat bled out of the land quickly, pulled upward by a sky so clear it felt exposed. Snow that had softened during the day crusted over, turning slick and treacherous. The high desert didn't forgive optimism for long. Ethan felt the shift in his bones before the instruments confirmed it. He stood outside the weather station just after dusk, breath fogging in front of him as he checked the anemometer mounted near the ridge. The wind had returned, not violent, but steady enough to drive temperatures down fast once night fully took hold. Maya had left an hour earlier, promising to return in the morning, her face tight with unease as she glanced back at the station one last time. "Be careful," she'd said. Ethan had nodded the way people do when they already know they're going to ignore that advice. Inside, the lioness rested with her cubs, strength slowly creeping back into her massive frame. He'd watched her stand earlier, unsteady but determined, guiding the cubs toward the heater with a patience that felt almost deliberate. They were still fragile, still dependent, but they were alive. That counted for something. Ethan turned away from the instruments and headed down the short slope behind the station, intent on checking the auxiliary generator housing. The storm had shifted debris during the night, and if the generator failed, the heater inside wouldn't last long. He moved carefully, boots crunching against ice-hidden stone, flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark. He didn't see the crack. The desert hid it well, a thin seam in the limestone shelf, filled with shadow and dusted over by snow. Ethan's foot slid into it without warning. His weight followed before his balance could catch up. The ground vanished. Ethan fell hard, the world tilting violently as he slid down a short but steep incline. His shoulder struck first, then his hip, knocking the breath clean out of his lungs. He reached for anything, rock, brush, air, but his gloves scraped uselessly against ice-slick stone. The fall ended with a brutal, bone-deep jolt. Pain exploded up his leg as something heavy slammed across his lower thigh. Ethan screamed, the sound torn raw from his chest, then clamped his teeth shut as the echo bounced uselessly off the canyon walls. For a moment, all he could do was breathe. His flashlight lay a few feet away, beam pointed uselessly into the dark. Snow drifted down around him in lazy flakes, already dusting his jacket, his hair, the exposed skin of his face. He reached for his leg, then froze as his fingers brushed the immovable weight, pinning it in place. A fallen slab of stone. Panic surged, sharp and immediate. But training cut through it just as quickly. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly, assessing the situation. The slab was too heavy to lift alone. His leg throbbed with a sick, pulsing heat that told him something was very wrong. He tried to shift, to pull free. The pain stole his breath again. "Damn it!" he hissed, voice trembling. He fumbled for the radio clipped to his jacket and pressed the call button. Static answered him. He tried again, angling the antenna, shifting his arm despite the pain. Nothing. The cold began to creep in almost immediately, seeping through his clothes, settling into the ground beneath him. Ethan knew the signs. He'd taught them. He'd warned others about this exact scenario during safety briefings years ago. Injury, immobility, falling temperatures. A deadly combination. He tilted his head back, staring up at the slice of sky framed by rock and shadow. Stars burned cold and distant above him, indifferent witnesses. His breath slowed despite his effort to control it, each exhale weaker than the last. Inside the weather station, the lioness lifted her head. The cubs slept, pressed close against her side, their bodies warm and solid against her ribs. She had been drifting, hovering somewhere between rest and awareness, when something tugged sharply at her attention. A scent, familiar, sharp with urgency and pain, threaded itself into the air. Human. Her ears pricked forward. She rose to her feet, ignoring the lingering weakness in her limbs, and moved toward the door. The cubs stirred, blinking up at her, confused. She nudged them gently back toward the heater, a firm push that brooked no argument. Then she turned, placed her weight against the door, and shoved. It rattled. She pushed again, harder. The door swung open, spilling cold air into the station. The lioness stepped out into the night, lowering her head immediately to read the ground. Snow muted most scents, but not all of them. The trail she followed was faint, broken, but it was enough. She moved with purpose now, each step steadier than the last. Back in the ravine, Ethan's thoughts drifted dangerously. His fingers felt numb. The pain in his leg dulled into something distant, replaced by a creeping warmth that set off alarms in his mind. "No," he whispered. "Stay awake." A sound reached him then, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. Crunch. Crunch. Ethan's eyes fluttered open. A shape moved at the edge of his vision, golden even in the dark, massive and deliberate. For a disoriented second, he thought he was hallucinating, that his mind had finally given up and conjured something impossible. Then the shape stepped closer. The lioness. "Hey," Ethan breathed, disbelief flooding his voice. You can't be real." The lioness reached him and lowered her head, sniffing his face urgently. Her breath was warm against his cheek. She let out a low rumble, deep and vibrating, a sound that seemed to cut through the fog in his head. She wasn't afraid. She circled him once, assessing the situation with quick, efficient movements, then focused on the slab of stone pinning his leg. Planting her paws firmly in the snow, she pressed her shoulder against it and pushed. The stone shifted, just a fraction. Pain tore through Ethan's body, sharp enough to make him cry out, but he clung to consciousness. The lioness pulled back and pushed again. She worked in bursts, pausing between efforts to check his face, her eyes bright and intent. With a final, forceful shove, the slab rolled free. Ethan gasped, dragging his leg toward him, shaking violently as sensation crashed back into it. Before the cold could reclaim him, the lioness stepped closer, lowering her massive body beside his. She pressed against him, her warmth surrounding his chest and shoulders, anchoring him to the world. Ethan let out a broken laugh, half sob, half breath. "You came back," he whispered. The lioness stayed, unmoving, eyes locked on his face as if daring him to slip away. In the distance, faint voices carried through the night, human voices calling his name. Help was coming. But it hadn't arrived first. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, the world narrowing to warmth, breath, and pressure. The lioness's body was pressed against his side, solid and alive, her heat cutting through the cold that had begun to hollow him out from the inside. Each time his thoughts started to slip, she nudged him, firm, insistent, bringing him back with a low vibration in her chest that felt less like a sound and more like a command. "Stay," he whispered, not sure whether he was speaking to himself or to her. "I'm here." The voices grew clearer. "Ethan. Ethan Walker." Flashlights flickered through the trees, beams slicing the dark into jagged shapes. Boots crunched over crusted snow. Radios crackled. The sound should have brought relief, but something tight and electric snapped through Ethan instead. He tried to lift a hand. Pain flared, sharp and blinding, and the world tilted again. The lioness rose immediately. She placed herself between Ethan and the approaching lights, her posture low, deliberate. every line of her body drawn with purpose. Snow dusted her back. Her breath steamed in steady clouds. She did not charge. She did not retreat. She guarded. The first ranger came into view and froze mid-step. "Oh hell!" someone muttered behind him. Hands went instinctively to belts. A rifle came up, the motion fast and practiced, its barrel catching the light. The air shifted, tense and brittle, as training and fear snapped into place. "Back away from him!" a voice shouted. "Now!" The lioness answered with a warning rumble that rolled across the ravine like distant thunder. Not an attack. A line drawn. No. Ethan forced the word out, raw and urgent. Don't shoot." The rifle wavered. "She's protecting me," Ethan said, his voice trembling but loud enough now to carry. "She saved my life." Maya pushed forward through the cluster of bodies, her breath coming fast as she took in the scene. Her eyes widened, flicking from Ethan's trapped leg to the lioness's stance, to the way she angled herself to block the wind from his chest. "Lower your weapons," Maya said sharply. "Are you out of your mind?" Someone hissed. "Lower them," she repeated. "Look at her." The lioness did not advance. She did not bare her teeth. She simply held her ground, eyes fixed on the humans, unblinking and unafraid. Snow continued to fall softly around them, settling on jackets and shoulders, on the black muzzle of a rifle, on the lioness's whiskers. The standoff stretched, fragile and unreal. Ethan's breath hitched. "She moved the stone," he said. "I was pinned. She kept me warm. If she hadn't come..." His voice broke, and he closed his eyes for a second, fighting the pull of darkness. "Please." A ranger with gray in his beard lowered his rifle an inch. Then another did the same. One by one, the barrels dipped, not fully relaxed, but no longer aimed. "Never seen anything like this," someone murmured. Maya crouched carefully, keeping her movement slow. "Ethan," she said gently, "we're going to get you out of here." The lioness tracked her with her gaze, muscles taut, ready to react. "It's okay," Ethan whispered, turning his head toward her as much as the pain allowed. "They're here to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the lioness did something that drew a sharp breath from everyone watching. She shifted her weight back, half a step, creating a narrow space between her body and Ethan's chest. Not retreat. Permission. The rangers moved quickly but carefully after that, sliding a splint into place, stabilizing Ethan's leg with practiced efficiency. Every movement was deliberate, announced aloud before it happened. Each time someone leaned in too close, the lioness let out a low sound, a reminder, not a threat, and they adjusted. When they lifted Ethan onto the stretcher, the lioness rose with him, pacing alongside, her shoulder brushing the edge of the frame. She stayed close enough that her warmth never left him. "We can't take her with us," a young ranger whispered urgently to Maya. "Protocol." "I know," Maya said, her eyes never leaving the lioness. "And I also know she won't let him out of her sight." They reached the station just as the wind picked up again, rattling the walls in familiar protest. The door was open. The cub's small cries cut through the tension. The lioness broke from the stretcher at once, crossing the threshold in 3 quick steps to reach them. She circled the cubs, touching each with her nose, then turned back toward Ethan. He lay on a cot near the heater now, face pale but eyes clear, watching her with a mix of disbelief and gratitude that felt too big for words. "She won't be contained," the gray-bearded ranger said quietly. "Not tonight," Maya nodded. "Then we don't force it." Decisions were made in low voices, shaped by what they'd seen and what none of them could explain away. Extra blankets were left. A radio was placed within Ethan's reach. A plan was formed that bent around reality instead of trying to crush it. As the Rangers prepared to leave, the lioness returned to Ethan's side. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead briefly against his hand, a contact so gentle it stole the breath from everyone who saw it. Ethan swallowed hard. "Thank you," he whispered. The lioness blinked slowly, deliberately, then turned back to her cubs. Outside, the engines faded into the night. Inside, something extraordinary settled into place. Not a victory, not an ending, but a truth none of them would ever forget. Spring arrived without ceremony. It didn't announce itself with warmth or birdsong at first, only with subtle concessions from the land. The snow thinned along the southern slopes. Ice loosened its grip on stone. Water began to move again, tracing quiet paths through places that had been frozen into silence for weeks. The high desert looked the same at a distance, but up close, everything was changing. So was Ethan. He sat near the open door of the weather station, his injured leg elevated on a crate, a brace wrapped tight beneath his jeans. Healing came slowly. The doctor had warned him. Bones remembered pain even after they mended. But Ethan didn't rush it. He had learned, finally, that some things couldn't be forced. Behind him, the station was no longer quiet. The cubs tumbled clumsily across the concrete floor, batting at each other with oversized paws, their movements uncoordinated and joyful. Their coats had thickened, grown richer in color. Their bellies were round with steady meals. Each squeak and thump echoed off the walls like proof, loud, undeniable proof, that they were alive. The lioness lay nearby, resting but alert, her head lifted as she watched them play. Strength had returned to her frame in subtle ways. She stood taller now, moved with ease. Her eyes tracked everything, her cubs, the open door, the horizon beyond it. She was waiting. Maya stood just outside, leaning against her truck, arms crossed loosely as she watched the scene unfold. She'd come every day since the night of the rescue, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to check in. No reports had been filed. No calls had been made beyond a carefully worded notice that the oddity had resolved itself. The truth didn't fit neatly into any form. "She's been pacing since dawn," Maya said quietly. "Circling the edge, testing the wind." Ethan nodded. "I know." He had felt it too. The restlessness in the air. The subtle shift in her behavior. The lioness wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't recovering. She was ready. Ethan rose carefully, leaning on his crutches as he stepped forward. The lioness turned toward him at once, eyes steady, attentive. The cubs froze mid-play, watching as if they understood that something important was happening. Ethan opened the door wider. Cool air flowed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and sun-warmed stone. Beyond the threshold, the desert stretched out in quiet invitation. The land was still harsh, still unforgiving. But it was no longer hostile in the same way. Life had found a foothold again. "It's time," Ethan said softly. The lioness stepped forward, stopping just inside the doorway. She lifted her head and breathed deeply, committing the moment to memory in a way humans never quite could. Then she turned back to Ethan. They held each other's gaze. No fear lived there now. No desperation. Only recognition. Ethan reached out, resting his hand briefly against her shoulder. The muscle beneath his palm was warm and solid, alive with strength. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "For all of it." The lioness blinked slowly. Then she stepped outside. The cubs bounded after her, unsteady but determined, their paws slipping once before finding purchase on the earth. She paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back one last time. The cubs pressed close to her sides, tails flicking with excitement. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, without ceremony, the lioness turned and led her cubs into the desert, their shapes slipping easily into the land, as if they had always belonged there. The gold of their coats shimmered once between the rocks, then vanished. The clearing felt larger after that. Quieter. Ethan stood in the doorway long after they were gone, the weight in his chest unfamiliar and sharp. He didn't feel abandoned. He felt completed. Days passed. The weather station returned to its routines. Data logged. Equipment maintained. Silence reclaimed the hours. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It no longer pressed in on Ethan's ribs. It breathed with him. One morning, as the sun crested the ridge, Ethan stepped outside with a mug of coffee warming his hands. The ground was damp from overnight melt. The air crisp and clean. He took a few careful steps forward, and stopped. Tracks crossed the clearing. Large paw prints, unmistakable, pressed cleanly into the soft earth. Beside them, smaller ones, 2 sets, paced unevenly, curious and bold. The trail stopped a few feet from the door. Something green caught his eye. A pine branch lay near the threshold, placed deliberately, its needles fresh. Ethan knelt slowly, tracing the edge of one print with his fingers. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He simply breathed. Across the clearing, Maya watched from her truck, one hand covering her mouth. Did she? Yes, Ethan said quietly. She did. Maya exhaled, eyes shining. Well, she said, voice thick. I guess some debts don't get forgotten. Ethan stood and looked toward the horizon, where the land rolled away into endless possibility. Some bonds don't either. The desert stirred gently, wind brushing through stone and scrub like a passing thought. Somewhere out there, a lioness and her cubs moved through the world, strong, alive, and unafraid. And here, in a quiet station once built to observe the weather, a man stood changed by a miracle no data set could ever explain. The snow was gone. What remained was something far more enduring. If this story stayed with you, even for a moment, just leave a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It helps us know you were here and that this story mattered to you. And if you believe that kindness can still cross every boundary, between fear and trust, between human and wild, consider subscribing. There are many more true stories like this waiting for you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of a community that still believes in compassion.